Good afternoon, everyone. We thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It is May 16th, and this is the Gravity Project Workgroup meeting where we will be going over data elements and a data element submission template that we have prepared for all of you. We have just a few administrative items to go over before we kick things off with our presenter, Lisa Nelson. So Lisa, if you can go to the next slide, we will go through these. Everyone is muted on entry to this meeting because we have a lot of participants. We appreciate your enthusiasm, but we are keeping the lines quiet because we do record these meetings and we post them on the Confluence Wiki following the meeting. If you have questions or comments, and if you joined us last week, you know that you can use your chat feature and send it to everyone. If you have thoughts or comments or questions during the presentation, so that we can do our best to keep open lines of communication and answer your questions as we go along and capture some of those comments that you have. And we appreciate all the feedback that we got last week. It was fantastic, and it was great input. If there's anything that we cannot cover during the call, if you want to reach out to us via email, or we can reach out to you to address anything that we were not able to get to on the call. Next slide, please. This is a slide that has our Confluence Wiki links. We did kick off this project on May 2nd, and many of you were probably on that call, and thank you for attending it. If you have not already done so, please go ahead and join the project as either a committed member or an other interested party. And these links are live in this presentation, and we will post it on the wiki and send them out in a follow-up email, so you don't have to scribble these down. But joining the project will allow us to communicate with you via email as we are using that list for all of our communications moving forward. So if you want to continue hearing from us, please do join as a committed member or an other interested party, and you can see what those levels of participation are on the wiki. There are definitions for both. Next slide, please. This is where we are in our schedule. We are on week 3. And we will be showing you a data element submission template, and Lisa Nelson will walk you through this in great detail so that you know what your marching orders are. And this is posted on the wiki so that you can download it following the meeting and get started working on that. And that will be also listed in the section on the wiki of review materials prior to the next meeting. Next slide, please. And at this point, I will hand it off to Lisa Nelson, but I also wanted to mention that another person on our EMI team, Linda Hyde, has also joined this call today. She is also a value sets subject matter expert and has given us a great deal of help in putting these templates together for all of you to use, and she is great support for Lisa and the rest of our team in giving you the information you need for data elements and for coding sets. So at this point, I will turn it over to Lisa. Lisa? I believe you might be on mute. I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead.
There you go. The double muting. Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
All righty. So the first portion of our call today is going to cover some deep dive into data element definitions, and we're going to establish common understanding for the language and the framework that we'll be using to talk about and create coded data elements in this project. We'll define some technical terms and look at an example to help make these definitions more concrete. In the second part of the call, we will explain how the group is going to work together to submit data elements for consideration in our 3 domain areas. And I'll walk you through the data element submission sheet and describe the overall process that we'll be following to come to consensus on what data elements need to be represented as coded data so that we can begin including discrete information for social determinants of health in the emerging digital information exchange ecosystem that's developing in health IT. We're going to follow an agenda that's similar to the pattern we used last week. We really appreciated all of the dialogue and discussion from all of the participants, so that will run pretty much like we did last week. and we'd like to just keep that collaborative spirit going. There will be 2 QA sessions, one of them after I cover the foundational part of the information and another after we go over the submission template. Lynette, we're getting some feedback. If you can scan for open mic.
I apologize. I'm trying to find who it is. Can everyone please check their devices and make sure they're muted? It sounds like a conference line. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, at this point, I am going to attempt a tricky feat here. Let's see, Lynette, you might have to help me through this a little bit. Do I just press on the open the poll button and see what happens here?
Yes, please.
Can't view the content you're sharing. If you want the content to be viewed, you need to put it on your screen.
Okay.
Okay, let's try that. So you should now be seeing a poll that asks.
I don't think so. You may need, I hate to interrupt the presentation, but you may need to stop sharing your presentation content.
You think so? I'm
I did get a poll
coming in.
Okay,
yep.
I was able to get a, okay,
yep.
Excellent. Thank you.
Super. All right, this is one of the trickier aspects of what we're trying to do here today,
yes,
but I'm going to use this as part of the demonstration as we talk through our example, our data element example. So if you could please take a minute to answer the question, what is the highest grade or level of school you have completed or the highest degree you have received? And I think I'm going to try sliding that off my screen so it gets out of the way while I move on to cover a couple other things. I'd like to talk through some background just to catch everyone up on a reminder to transition from last week's material. We reviewed last week that there is the concept of data structures that are used to share information across disparate systems. And we showed how data structures comprise these data elements that we're talking about. Data elements use value sets or value set groupings to describe the range of allowable concepts that may be populated for the data element. And the concepts in those value sets are represented with codes that come from a code system. So those are really all the key terms that we're hoping you'll start to feel comfortable with. I did have a picture here of what a data element looks like in the context of a structure. So here you see this is a FHIR resource for an encounter data structure. And
Lisa,
I just called.
This is Lynette.
Yes?
I hate to interrupt. Can you slide the poll back over for just another 30 seconds or so?
Sure.
It looks like when you move it from your screen, it hides it from everyone.
It stops from people being able to answer.
Yes.
Okay, well, I'll just
this
tuck it into the corner
about,
here.
About being technical and using dual monitors.
Okay, I'll leave it tucked into the corner. It shouldn't be in the way too much. And in a couple of minutes, it looks like most people have stopped answering, but I'll leave it up for a couple of minutes more. Okay. So the 2 data elements that I have highlighted here are status, so encounter status, which is a code, and you can see the values that it can hold over here, and encounter type, which is a codable concept that's given by a value set called encounter type. So that's just to help you get a feeling for where data elements fit into the larger exchange fabric that is developing around there in health IT. And we talked last week also about why we are using nationally recognized code systems and which code systems are relevant for encoding data that's associated with different activities in the care planning and delivery cycle. And we talked about how LOINC and SNOMED and ICD-10 and CPT and HCPCS come together to give us a rich fabric of concepts and coded concepts that can be used to describe information used within the care planning and delivery cycle. We also covered a basic set of steps of how you go from where we are in Project Gravity around data element definition to the end goal of discretely coded information that is flowing between systems. And this is important because this is really the aspect of where we're headed to be able to share social determinant of health information. The example that I showed last week of an actual discrete data representation inside of a Exchange document, this happens to be XML inside of a consolidated CDA encounter summary, but I wanted to just make it real for you that human readable information about, for example, a person's education level can be communicated both for humans to understand and read and encoded in these discrete entry representations to make it easier for computers to process the information consistently as well. So here you see an observation that holds that code information that is representing current educational attainment, and along with that, a person's response for that data element, which is a value that comes as a coded piece of information with a code from Loink answer set that also says this person has a master's degree. And this is really the aspect of what we're trying to do, is to bring together the ability to know how to make codings that correspond with the information that we mean to exchange with each other and with each other's systems. So that's a kind of another picture, again, to help you understand what we're doing. I'm going to close the poll now. I think everybody is done answering. Lynette, do I need to do anything besides just move it off my screen to close it?
Yes, I believe you can let it sleep until you want to display the results.
To display the results. Okay, very good.
You may need to move that little window back into your screen.
All right, I'll give it a try when we get there. Everyone will be waiting with bated breath to see how it all turned out. So this slide is kind of the meat of the presentation today. It's our main lesson, some new terms around how do we actually create a well-defined data element definition. And in order to do this, you need to be able to name the data element and then succinctly describe its purpose and identify its data type. And by data type, I mean concepts like it could be a date, it could be an integer or a Boolean, something that holds a true, false, or yes, no type of information, or it can be a coded concept, and that's one of the things that we will be focused on primarily. When the data type is a coded concept, then the way you end up expressing the range of values that the data element can hold is first described by the set of concepts that that data element can hold. That's what's called a concept domain. And the concept domain, after a code system is selected for use with the data element, that concept domain is what is used to identify the value set that will be used to represent that information with codes for better machine processing. A data element definition also includes some special instructions around how the data can be captured. For example, if unknown or other would be allowable values. And the origin of the data element definition is also captured with its definition so that we can distinguish one definition from another. I'm sure you can imagine, and one of the things that we're up against is many different data definitions of the same data element, and we're trying to sort all of that out in this project. So this is the next level of technical terms that we'll be throwing around as we attempt to create and explain and define data elements. This next slide is a picture of what I just described with words, because some of us just relate to information better with pictures than with narrative. This picture says the same thing that I just described. Here's your data element being defined. Here's some provenance information about who created this definition. The data element definition includes both the concept itself and its data type and some properties about that concept. along with the concept domain that explains the range of values that can be used to populate that data element, along with some processing instructions that help us to understand special aspects of what's allowed when instantiating or representing one of these data elements. I'm a picture person, so I always prefer that. I did want to show you that picture again of the structured data entry for the social history observation, just because we tend to focus on coded concepts in the gray boxes we talked about before. But I just wanted to give you an example of a data element that is another data type. So here, for example, the effective time is telling us the point in time at which this person's current educational attainment was recorded. And you see here this is September 10th of 2012. And so data elements can be different data types. They don't all follow the same pattern of just being coded concepts. Here's another example of a date that is the time at which someone recorded that information. So just wanted to show you a little bit of some of the different data types. The next thing that we'll cover is an example of a well-formed data element. And I have for you an example from LOINC that I picked out that will be a little bit bigger than my PowerPoint slide for us to look at. And I'll start with the basic definition of the data element. Here is the coded concept that is the code that has been assigned to this concept in LOINC. And you can see its name. It has both a long name and a shorter name. Let me open this next screen so you can see the long common name articulates the full question nature of this concept. And then it has a short name that's a little bit easier to say, current educational attainment. You can see some properties about the data element, and these are specific to how the LOINC code system organizes and classifies concepts in its code system, a little bit about some of the places where this definition comes from. You can see some of these basic attributes also tell you a little bit about the version of the code system that it's in and its status relative to where it's used in different places. And then we get into the right-hand side of that data element definition. And here you see the set of concepts or the concept domain that's associated with this data element. And LOINC produces for us value sets that can be used using their LOINC answer codes. So attached to each one of these answer concepts over on the right-hand side, you can see a code associated with that. And the value set made from these concepts is represented in these codes. I wanted to use this opportunity to also show you the meaning of that extra concept that we talked about called value set groupings. This is a new term that not everyone has heard as much as the notion of value sets, but you can see here in the possible answers for this data element, there's a couple on the bottom that get to that issue of instructions or thinking through possible values that might be appropriate for this data element. And we have recorded here that you may need to record that the person did not want to answer the question. And so there is a notion that this data element could have a refused concept associated with it or a don't know. And these are both notions that are different from, you can kind of see, different from the main set of answers that were developed up here. They are also coded, available from a different code system. So this refused notion is actually coming from a code that was developed in SNOMED as a qualifier. And the way that we build and structurally put this kind of information together once it's established and becomes a value set, I'm just going to briefly show you a screen to give you a view into the Value Set Authority Center, which is a tool that we use to capture and publish value sets to make them available for all implementers to access. And here you would see from our example, this is a value set that is representing level of education, and it is a grouping value set that includes two smaller value sets. And I made these, one to include all of the LOINC answer concepts, and then from SNOMED CT, I made the little partition that associates those special codes that were associated with refused and do not allow. So this is an example of how value sets can be partitioned into different pieces, and we can put them together ultimately to sort of facilitate the representation of a data element like this. So this is the deep weeds of what happens with a data element definition, and at this point, I think the next thing I want to try to do is to reveal our poll results. So I am going to take us back to our presentation in the background. I am going to ask for poll results, and Lynette, if I'm doing this right, and then apply. Hopefully that's all I need to do.
I see them, Lisa. They're good.
You do?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So is this what I'm going to see right here? The results of this is 66 out of, or do I see something different from that?
No, we have results for each one. So if you can't see them and Lynette can't see them as a host, I can read them out. I think the rest of the community should see them. There is, for those that cannot see them, the polling is there. It's another drop down, under your chat. So if you have a chat feature, you can look down. You should see polling, and if you open that up, you see the results. So I can just say we have 100.
That's okay.
I could read
just
them out.
summarize it. Thank you. No, give us a summary of the answers, the results.
Okay. So first of all, thank you, everyone, 134 respondents. So I will say the majority have D, master's degree, 49%, followed by S, refused or no, sorry, I guess that was a G. No answer was 25%. The next one was tied, almost, undergraduate at 13%, and doctorate degree at 12%.
Thank you very much, Evelyn, and I apologize for the technical difficulties. We did not rehearse this, but as the presenter, it turns out that I was the only one who was able to put up the poll, and I didn't practice doing it before, so sorry for that. The important thing the point that I wanted to make in showing this poll is to bring us to understand some of the perils and pitfalls that we will be going through as we attempt to work towards well-defined data element definitions. As you can see, the LOINC definition that we've had was different in a little bit, in several ways, from the questionnaire that I just put forward in the poll. Although we can see the very high correspondence between these two things, there are some key differences. And I just want to point this out so that you can understand some of the challenges that we face. First of all, you can't see it so well on my screen here. In the tooltip you can see we did a good job of representing the data element according to the actual question concept associated with this code, 63504-5. However, when it comes to identifying what the possible answers are, for example, I didn't mean to get rid of my LOINC screen. Hang on one second. I need to be able to scroll all the way down here so that you can see this. Okay, so where it says high school diploma, it might be hard to understand whether that is really the code associated with high school graduate or GED or equivalent. So you can see that in the way that this poll was presented, we really did not stay true to the data element definition. And this could cause trouble down the road if we needed to be able to clarify or understand if the answers in A were really related with code 14, sequence 15 link answer code over here, or sequence number 15, the GED equivalent. The other thing that I wanted to mention on some of the trickier things, besides just sort of the accuracy of how we represent the answers, is that this goes all the way down to the specific notions that are presented. Like here we said undergraduate degree, where the real concept is bachelor's degree, and it takes us all the way to just fine minutia detail around the spelling differences and the way that the concept might be presented in the questionnaire resource or polling device. So this we've missed the punctuation on master's degree. And in the bottom, you see that while we accounted for the possibility that people may choose not to answer this question, we didn't anticipate that the polling mechanism also records something called no answer. And so there could be, within the structure of the information as it's represented, there could be the necessity for us to take into consideration what's called null flavors, where information is represented as actually not being present. And all of these details and nuances are important when we do data element definitions, because if we don't get to this level of accuracy, we ultimately will face the perils later when we begin coding and trying to exchange the information. I have one last point to make in this part of the presentation before we go on to take questions, and that is about the notion of common data elements. What does it really mean when we say common? This notion of a common data element is something that can be considered a bit relative. Common to whom? And it's important to remember that the Gravity Project is a U.S. national effort. And so our notion of common is to get to a place where we have appropriate U.S. Available code systems, and we have the ability to achieve interoperability based on the standards and the advisory, interoperability standard advisory kind of information that we have at the national level. So a common data element, it has to have a standardized format like we reviewed today. It needs to have a single accepted definition so that we aren't all in different points of view about what it means and how it's used, and we need to be able to have that documented in a way that it can be applied consistently everywhere systems will be using this information to code social determinants of health. This is really an important point because it is this kind of collaboration that will bring us to a place where we have concepts and codes that will provide us with consistency in how the data can be collected and represented. It will ensure that we have stakeholder agreement across the whole space to be using definitions that we can all understand. This facilitates semantic interoperability between our different EHR and health IT systems, and ultimately facilitates data processing and aggregation, kind of apples to apples across systems, and enables the kind of reuse that we really envision being able to achieve when data is captured during the care delivery system and then used again for quality and research and public health. So this is definitely going to be a difficult and detailed journey, but it is the only way that we will be able to progress to step 4 on this slide, which is our end goal of being able to include discretely coded social determinants of health information. And with that, I will let Lynette lead us in a Q&A session for 5 or 10 minutes.
And I see answers to at least one of these questions coming through from the community, and we appreciate your feedback. So I will point out that Lucy had asked the question, Lucy Johns, and Al Taylor has answered her in the chat. So if you want to read that, you are more than welcome to. Leslie had a question asking, where are modifiers indicated that are associated with the element, like risk?
Modifiers would be represented in structural data elements. That's why I keep going back to those slides to explain how there's a larger data structure that wraps around observations or procedures or goals, anything that we'll be representing like that. And so there are different pieces within the data structure that can hold corresponding concepts. Most of you, or many of you, probably have been exposed to the kinds of resource modeling that's available in the FIRE standard, and some are familiar with the template modeling available in CDA, and those individual structural pieces will allow us to pull together a modifier, an additional observation that might be, like one example is sort of a clinical status that's associated with a problem observation. And when we need to pair notions together, we define the data elements individually, and then we join them for representation in a more complex data structure.
Thanks, Lisa. And I did want to bring up Lucy John's question. I will ask the question and then I will read the response from Al Taylor. Thank you, Al. And Lisa, if you want to elaborate, please feel free. Lucy asked, is there a place within each data element to specify why ask this? In other words, what do we know as a result of asking this that enhances understanding of appropriate care and or appropriate community intervention, such as policy, etc.? And Al's answer was the reason for asking the question is based on a clinical need, so it will vary. Sometimes the why can be discerned from the source of the question, such as a standard questionnaire like Phoenix or NHANES, and the organization who required that question. Is there anything you would like to add to that, Lisa?
Well, I think some community discussion. I know we have some code system representatives who are on the call from LOINC and SNOMED, and maybe they'd be able to also just add some insight on what other background information can be recorded when concepts are added into code systems.
And this is Evelyn. Just a reminder to everyone, if you are muted, please raise your hand and Lynette can unmute you if you cannot mute yourself.
We have a very quiet group today.
Quiet group.
Evelyn,
go ahead.
This is Beth Connor from CMS, and I can give an example of how some of this information could be, some of that data elements can be used. So at CMS in the post-acute care space, there are specific questionnaires that are required for all patients that are admitted to a post-acute care facility. And the data elements that are included on these assessments, these patient assessments, sometimes are administrative, sometimes are clinical in nature, but the data elements are defined and used for a variety of purposes. So the information can be used for care planning by providers. It can be used when it's submitted to CMS for payment purposes or quality measurement purposes. So there's a variety of reasons how the data elements might be used. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but that's one example.
Beth, thank you. I think that is really helpful, and often we know these reasons when we're creating the data element, and I think Lucy's question just gets to the point of whether or not we would be able to write those down so that in the data element definition, one of the properties that might be represented might be a property of the rationale for the use of the data element, and certainly the data element definition as a framework would allow for that kind of thing. And it would really be just, if this is something that is important to the community and comes from our discussions and work together, we will likely need to work hand in hand with all of the major code system stewards that we've identified to ask for new codes, to ask about codes that might need to be removed, or make recommendations even about the wording associated with codes. And this idea of perhaps including rationale or the purpose for the use of the data element could be something that would be a property that we could ask about how each code system would allow us to record that if we have a way of capturing it. And I think sometimes data elements get used for a variety of purposes. Once they're out there in the community, it might be difficult to anticipate all of the possible uses, but we certainly could I don't think we take the time to always write down the rationale for different data elements right now.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. And Leslie had a follow-up question, and I'm going to ask both of these questions in tandem because I think they may relate to each other, so forgive me if I have misinterpreted. But we had a follow-up question from Leslie asking, how will we make sure the elements are in consumer-friendly terms or a consumer vocabulary? And then Richard Bookman followed up to her question with, how do any of these coding schemes indicate levels of privacy or security? For example, psychiatry notes are generally kept in a safe harbor, not widely available. Provision of extra privacy and security levels would seem to be patient first and patient friendly. So I think we need to answer maybe consumer friendly and patient friendly and secure.
I think they're different. This is Leslie. I think they're a little bit different in that when we think about SNOMED and LOINC, we're thinking about medicine. And when we pull up patient education, for instance, we pull it up based upon the terms known in medicine. Now, when we're going to use social determinants of health, that's in the language that the patient uses. If we impose a medicalized version, then we could run afoul of getting information directly from the patients themselves, because it's yet again a misunderstanding or term that isn't well understood by the patient community. So just food for thought as we go forward.
Mm-hmm. It's funny that you say food for thought, Leslie, because I was thinking of an article that was published by the American Academy of Dietetics, Nutrition and Dietetics, about some code work that they have been doing. And one of the learnings that they had in there is that we need to be more aware of the fact that all of this information is accessible by patients now, and design for the future where people will have access to their own health records, and we need to think about the terms that we use as this information becomes exposed. I was looking at the example of even just the choice of the word refuse on the option of that somebody may choose not to answer the question. And refuse is a pretty harsh kind of word, and if it was going to be exposed that I refuse to answer the question, maybe we would want to consider the language associated with these concepts. I believe in the work that we will be doing, because we are starting, in the next part of this I'll show you the submission sheet, we are starting with concept domains. This is identifying the information that we need to be able to capture throughout the care, delivery, and planning and delivery cycle. And so we have the opportunity to think about the language that we would want to have used to represent these concepts. And if we start with a very clinical vocabulary, then that's what the code system folks are going to work with us to represent. But if we as a community choose to take a different perspective on that and ask ourselves as part of our consensus building and adjudication process, are the words that we've chosen the right words for the potential uses, which include sharing the information with the patient? We might want to have that be a part of our typical review cycle.
Thanks, Lisa. This is Lynette. We have a lot of other questions pouring in, but we do need to move on to the next section, so we will try to address some of these in the next Q&A.
Okay, and we do keep all the chat questions, so if there's any questions that we don't get to, we'll follow up with an FAQ kind of a thing on the Confluence site to make sure that we get all your questions answered. And thank you for that. Okay, the second part of the presentation is the real how-to nuts and bolts part. And I'll just remind everyone that we will be working through 3 domains throughout July and August. We'll be working on food insecurity, and in August and September we will be working on housing instability, and then in October and November we will be working on transportation access. We will be covering these serially so that everyone can participate rather than sort of divide and conquer, but this doesn't mean that you need to wait to get started to collect your input. So the templates that I'm going to show you now and the process that we'll be describing about getting your data element submission in, there's no need to wait on, for example, transportation access, just because we're going to be going through the adjudication process together during this time frame. The basic process that we will follow includes downloading a template from the Confluence site, and I'm going to show you that in just a minute. And then you will populate this spreadsheet with some concepts that are important to your organization from your point of view as a stakeholder and where you sit in the ecosystem, things that you need to be able to say and record and would like to have the ability to record discreetly. You identify what those concepts are. And then you email this template back to the Gravity Project at the email that you see on the screen. We will then, through the magic and expertise of folks like Linda Hyde, who are supporting this project and have a great deal of experience with the code systems that we're working with, we will triage that input and put the information into a little bit better order. We might add codes that you didn't find, and it's not even necessary for you to be able to pull codes. The important thing is that you can document the concepts that you need to be able to express across the different activities, and we will do this initial adjudication for the community to put all of the input for a particular domain area together into a single spreadsheet that can then be reviewed by the group as a whole. And that's what those time bars on the Gantt chart that I showed before are. Our work as a work group to review, to address questions, to take on the issues of language and representation and the way that the concepts even fit together across the activities in the care planning and delivery cycle. We'll be looking at that together to see if we can develop consensus around some data elements that we can begin to ask for codes for, and then ultimately be able to create value sets and begin representing in data structures for information exchange. So that's the goal, is to have the work group be able to vet and confirm or approve the data elements that we will put together as our deliverable from the Gravity project. I would like to show you this spreadsheet because part of what's important about the spreadsheet is that it takes a lot of this background information, the technical definitions and relationships that we described today. It takes that into consideration so you don't have to feel like you are an expert at data element definition to get started with this. You can benefit from the structure of the Excel spreadsheet that we've created for you as a template. And I will now show you on the Gravity web Confluence site how you go about getting to these spreadsheets, and I'll show you an example of both the template that you use to put your information in and a sample of one that's been populated by a couple of volunteers who were our guinea pigs to go through this initially and help us flesh out the collection template. So if you make your way to the Gravity Project homepage, which is on the HL7 Confluence site under the Patient Care Work Group, you will see a quick links area in the top right-hand corner. Right about in the middle of there, you see Data Element Submission Template and Instructions. That's the first and most obvious place to find it. We also repeat that link down under the area where we talk about materials for review prior to workgroup meetings, right on the top of that list. same link to the data element submission template. And if you click on that, either one of them will take you to the data element submission page where we have collected for you the basic instructions of, that I just went over about how to pick up this template, rename it. I'm going to just focus for a second on step number 2 here, so that we do not have collisions between the files that are coming back from different people who will be participating. We do ask that you rename the template so that you will include your organization name, underscore the domain we're working on. So first up is the food insecurity domain, your name, either your last name or something, so we can identify really who is associated with that, so we can get back to you with questions, and then the date of your submission, so something that sort of helps us keep track of the version of it. So you'll rename the template for your use, and then go through and populate concepts into that. And there's instructions I'm going to show you, but we also have in this link a populated example that will help you orient yourself if you want to just see what's a good example of how to populate the template. We have that example. Let me show you both the template and the populated example. The template has instructions, a bit of a key in the very first tab. Reminder about renaming the sheet, some background information on the different tabs that are available, and what some of the key terms are, some definitions around what does it mean if you have got standardized and validated instruments that are the backup to the originating source behind some of the data elements. There's a place where you can record if that's the case, and just other information that you can see that helps you populate things. It's very important. There's a reference section that can help you include links to forms or to white papers or articles that back up the creation of the data elements. And if you can't supply a link, perhaps it's a publishable paper that not everybody can get to, we ask that you include it as a file, send it along, and just reference the file name. So there's instructions in that key, and then there are 4 main tabs that correspond to those 4 activities that we've been talking about in the care, delivery, and planning cycle. And in here, each of the columns of information has a nice comment at the top that tells you what the information is about, gives you an example of what you would populate in that column on a row-by-row basis. There's room to record information about assessment-type questions, diagnoses that are assessed needs or assessed problems that the patient may have, goals that they may be working toward to address or minimize the problems and needs, and then ultimately interventions that can be planned or performed to help someone reach those goals. And so those are the 4 main tabs across here for collecting. I wanted to comment about code systems, but I'm going to make that I'm going to show you the populated sheet because I think it will help to not have the comments showing and give you an example. So on the assessments tab, one of the things that you will notice, there's a couple of gray columns that Linda and I will be using to classify entries as we do the first round of adjudication. You don't worry about filling those out. Orange is the main area that's important for you to populate. And here we have some examples from Sarah DeSilvi, who is working with us from the Yale School of Nursing, and she had some examples that were standardized and validated instruments in the food security space. And you see the repeating nature of this row of information. And in case you're wondering why, it's because as this progresses across, we ultimately have to get to the place where this data element's value set is defined. And so here, as you go across the street, across this row, you eventually end up into the place where you can document the concept answers that go along with the question. And so the repeating nature of this concept is because it has several different answers that are allowed to be represented for it. And if you've been working on content already, the format is probably not too unusual, but if you're new to it, I would say the biggest thing to try and focus on is getting your concepts, your answer concepts that go along with your question concept, and Linda and I will help formulate the rest. The far right includes that reference column that we talked about, so that if you have a particular toolkit or reference to go along with it, it would be listed there. I will briefly mention that there's a mapping that's going on. If you recall, we did identify that for some activities, multiple code systems may be relevant. And so I will take you just across an example here where you can see that in the area of interventions, we have identified interventions that could be expressed in SNOMED CT, CPT, or HCPCS. And if you find correspondence and you're working at this level where you do find correspondence across code systems, we represent that by keeping the information on the same row. And if you find that the concept is represented but they don't seem to be corresponding, then you would just not put them on the same row. On the same row is a sort of the notion of a mapping across different code systems. With 5 minutes left, I think I have covered all of the main points that I wanted to go through. Let me see if there was anything left in my PowerPoint. Nothing but the questions page. So Linnell, with 5 minutes or 6 minutes or so, let's see what kind of questions we have.
Let me get back to my list here. I'm asking these as they were queued up, so there are several of you whose questions we will not be able to get to in the next 2 minutes before we need to start to adjourn this meeting and give you due dates and homework. This question is from, actually first there was a comment from Helene saying, this also seems very US-based centric. Other countries might classify, and she's talking about the education levels as pre-primary, primary, secondary, tertiary, etc., which also explain no answers. And Ajay Gupta replied, Helene's comment is important if or when we want to share health data on an international basis. And I don't think that was a question. I just wanted to mention that it was commented on at that point. Rachel?
Yeah.
Rachel
I think scope. You know, I don't know if anybody else answered to that, Lynette. Did anyone else address that? But I think that
there may have been one other comment. I don't remember. I was capturing questions.
Mm-hmm.
But again, we have a list of all of these. Rachel Barron Van Cleve asks, is the goal of the Gravity project only to enable data to flow between EHRs or also to allow standardized data to flow to payers or a state government?
Yes, the stakeholder scope for the Gravity project is as broad as all of the stakeholders. Some of the glide path slides that we've shown earlier show this content ultimately being able to empower projects like Karen, which involve patient communication, Da Vinci, which is communication with payers and between providers and payers, and other registry type projects. And so the goal is to enable this information to be shared across the health ecosystem.
Evelyn, did you have a comment on that?
I was just going to let the community also, to Lisa's point, we have a lovely visual we created where we show the glide path for this work. So absolutely, you know, the initial input is at the clinical setting, but the point is if you document it in a standardized and coded way, it can be reused upstream or for upstream or downstream activities.
Okay, thank you. Jim Myers asked, it might be helpful to show an example. Say the hunger vital signs 2 questions are asked by many already. How would this data element taxonomy play out for these 2 questions? Also, how would a risk stratification be captured based on the client's response to these 2 questions?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think that the example of the populated spreadsheet is where I would recommend that you start to answer how do I go about, I would go to the assessment tab if you're interested in see how to do assessments, and I think work through one of these examples to see how you represent the tool or the screening tool, what the main question is and what the answers are. Follow this pattern and see if you can address that question, and if you can't, we have provided an email address that you can email us with the specific challenge that you're having. As for risk stratification, I think that is beyond the scope of what we are covering in Gravity, in Gravity Project, although there are payer participants in our community, and they may be able to comment on how the information would feed into risk stratification, or maybe perhaps in the research space to answer that.
Thanks, Lisa. At this point, I think we probably need to move on to the next slide so that everybody is aware of what needs to happen next before we adjourn. Like Lisa said, you will download the spreadsheet from the Confluence Wiki. There are several links in this presentation that are live. And we also encourage you to join the project if you have not, if you are, so that you can keep in touch with us and we can retain communications with you. Sorry, I was hearing background noise and trying to type and talk at the same time. That never goes well. But we are looking for these spreadsheet templates to be populated and submitted probably before the end of June, because we are focusing on food insecurity for the first 4 to 6 weeks of this project at this point. So it would be 4 to 6 weeks from now. So if you can take some time just to work through those spreadsheets and to submit your content before the end of June. And we don't have an exact date because this is new to all of us. So there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve, and we will probably need to be a little bit flexible on how we move forward. But kind of have that end date in your minds. If you have any issues at all, please do email us. Our email address is several times in this deck as well. We will send you all a follow-up email with all these links in it. And if we want to go to the next slide, our email address is here. You can always reach us. We do our best to get back to you as quickly as possible. But we will look forward to seeing your content submissions as you begin work on those. And we will adjourn, and we will talk to you all next week. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.